In the summer of 1985 in western Kansas, where the wind did not simply pass through, but instead carved its opinions into the soil like a stubborn editor marking up a manuscript, there lived a farmer named Thomas Hale, who stood on the edge of 640 acres of wheat that had fed his family for 3 generations, and yet now seemed to whisper a different future, one that he could not explain without sounding like he had lost his grip on reality. Because while every neighbor measured success in bushels per acre, and the steady hum of combines slicing gold into profit, Thomas had begun to notice something unsettling in the patterns of his land, something quieter than drought but more persistent than pests, thinning of life that no fertilizer invoice could reverse, and no extension pamphlet could adequately diagnose, and it was in that uneasy noticing that a dangerous idea began to take root. The kind of idea that does not arrive loudly but instead lingers like a question that refuses to leave the room even after everyone else has gone home. For years, the numbers had followed a predictable rhythm that felt as reliable as sunrise, with winter wheat planted across hundreds of acres each fall, harvested in early summer, and sold at prices that fluctuated between $2.80 and $340 per bushel, depending on the whims of global markets and local weather, while Thomas relied on a fleet of machinery that included a 1978 John Deere 440 tractor, a drill seeder calibrated with near-religious precision, and a combine that had seen better decades, but still roared to life each June like an aging lion refusing to surrender. Yet despite all of this apparent order, the soil itself had begun to behave differently, holding less moisture after rain, forming crusts that resisted roots, and yielding crops that looked healthy from the road but told a different story under closer inspection, where yields slipped from 45 bushels per acre down to 32, and then to 28, numbers that did not scream crisis, but whispered decline in a tone that only someone paying attention would hear. It was during one unusually dry August, when the temperature hovered above 95 degrees for 12 straight days, and the wind carried dust instead of relief, that Thomas made a decision that would fracture his standing in the community and possibly end his career, because instead of preparing the fields for the next planting season with the usual routine of tilling and herbicide application, he chose to do something that felt almost like betrayal to everything he had been taught, which was to do nothing at all, to let the land rest, to allow what his neighbors called weeds to grow back across sections of his acreage, to invite chaos into a system that had been built on control, and to trust that something valuable might emerge from what everyone else had spent decades trying to eliminate. The idea did not come from a single source, but rather from fragments of observation and late-night reading, from soil conservation reports that spoke in cautious language about native grasses and biodiversity, from old journals written by his grandfather describing fields before they were fully cultivated, and from the simple, stubborn memory of how the land had once smelled after rain, richer and more alive than it did now. Yet translating those fragments into action required a kind of courage that bordered on recklessness, because the bank that held his operating loan did not care about ecological experiments, and the local grain elevator certainly did not pay premiums for philosophical shifts. And so Thomas found himself standing alone in a decision that could either restore his land or strip him of it entirely. By September, when most farmers in the region were calibrating their drills and calculating seed rates for the coming season, Thomas parked his equipment along the edge of the field and watched as patches of native grasses, wildflowers, and what others dismissed as invasive species began to reclaim the soil, their roots digging deeper than any wheat crop had in decades, their presence both unsettling and strangely reassuring, like watching strangers move into a house you thought you owned but secretly knew needed new life. And as the colors shifted from green to a mix of browns and muted golds under the autumn sun, the whispers from neighbors grew louder, carrying across fence lines and into town conversations where his name was no longer spoken with quiet respect, but with a kind of puzzled disbelief. What Thomas could not yet explain, even to himself, was whether he was witnessing the beginning of renewal or simply the slow unraveling of everything his family had built, because while the land seemed to respond with a kind of cautious resilience, the financial reality loomed like a storm that did not need clouds to announce its arrival. And as he stood there one evening, watching the wind ripple through plants he had once been taught to destroy, a single question settled into his mind with the weight of consequence, one that would not let him sleep easily and would shape every decision that followed. Was he restoring the future of his farm, or quietly signing its end? By the time winter settled over western Kansas with its pale skies and fields that looked more like forgotten canvases than productive farmland, Thomas Hale had already become a quiet spectacle in coffee shops and grain elevators, where conversations carried a tone that hovered somewhere between concern and ridicule, because in a region where 640 acres of land was expected to produce a predictable cycle of winter wheat each year, the sight of dormant fields covered in tangled remnants of native grasses and so-called weeds felt less like innovation and more like negligence dressed up as philosophy. And while Thomas continued his routine of checking fence lines and maintaining equipment that now sat idle for longer than anyone thought sensible, the rest of the community leaned into the certainty that he had made a mistake that would soon correct itself through financial pressure if not common sense. It was during one particularly cold January morning, when the temperature dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind sliced through coats as if they were mere suggestions rather than protection, that Thomas stopped by the local diner in town, place where farmers gathered not just for food but for validation of their shared assumptions. And as he stepped inside, the warmth did little to soften the shift in conversation that followed his arrival. Because while no one directly confronted him with hostility, the subtle glances and half-finished jokes carried a message that was clearer than any accusation, which was that he had stepped outside the boundaries of what was considered rational farming, and in doing so had placed himself somewhere between curiosity and cautionary tale. A man named Carl Benson, who farmed nearly 200 acres of wheat, and prided himself on yields consistently above 50 bushels per acre thanks to aggressive fertilizer use and newer machinery, including a recently purchased combine that gleamed like a promise of efficiency, eventually broke the silence with a comment that sounded casual but landed with precision, asking Thomas how many bushels per acre his weeds were producing this year, a question that drew a few restrained laughs and turned all eyes toward him, not out of malice but out of a shared need to reaffirm that the traditional system still held authority over outcomes. Thomas did not respond immediately, because the truth was that he had no numbers to offer, no yield reports, no contracts with grain elevators, no forward pricing agreements locking in a future that banks could recognize as stability. And so instead he spoke in a way that only deepened the divide between him and the room, explaining that he was observing changes in soil structure, noting how moisture retention seemed to improve after even light snowfall, and describing root systems that extended deeper than wheat typically allowed, details that sounded more like academic abstractions than practical farming to those who depended on each season to pay off operating loans and machinery payments. Outside of town, the financial reality was becoming less abstract and more immediate, because Thomas's decision to halt planting meant that his usual revenue stream, which had averaged roughly $60,000 to $75,000 annually, depending on market prices and yield fluctuations, had effectively dropped to zero for that cycle, while expenses such as property taxes, equipment maintenance, and loan interest continued their steady march forward, creating a gap that could not be filled with optimism or long-term thinking. And as letters from the bank began to arrive with increasing frequency and less patience in their tone, the experiment that had once felt like a deliberate choice began to resemble a narrowing path with fewer exits. His wife, Margaret Hale, who had supported him with a quiet strength that often went unnoticed in public discussions, but was essential in private moments, began to ask questions that were not rooted in doubt of his intentions, but in concern for their shared future. because while she could see the changes in the land and even appreciate the return of birds and insects that had been absent for years, she also understood the language of bills and deadlines, and the reality that a philosophy, no matter how compelling, could not negotiate with a lender or delay a payment indefinitely. As the weeks passed and winter slowly gave way to the hesitant beginnings of spring in early March of 1986, the fields that had been left untouched began to show signs of life that were both chaotic and intricate, with a mix of native grasses, wildflowers, and resilient species pushing through the soil in patterns that defied the neat rows of conventional planting. And while Thomas walked those fields with a growing sense of cautious validation, the rest of the community saw only disorder, interpreting the absence of uniformity as evidence that he had surrendered control rather than redefined it. The tension between these two interpretations grew sharper with each passing day, because while Thomas was beginning to believe that he was witnessing the early stages of a system that could sustain itself with fewer inputs and greater resilience to weather extremes, the bank was preparing to reassess his creditworthiness based on the absence of income, and his neighbors were quietly placing bets, not out of cruelty but out of habit, on how long it would take before he returned to planting wheat like everyone else. And in that widening gap between belief and expectation, Thomas found himself facing a different kind of question than the one that had first driven his decision, one that was less philosophical and more immediate, and far more difficult to ignore. How long could he hold on to an idea before the cost of proving it became too high to bear? As the spring of 1986 unfolded with a kind of hesitant generosity, bringing scattered rains that arrived just often enough to stir growth but not enough to satisfy the expectations of conventional wheat farmers, Thomas Hale found himself drawn deeper into the daily rituals of observation rather than intervention, walking the full stretch of his 640 acres with a notebook in hand, recording changes that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else but felt like pieces of a larger pattern slowly revealing itself, because where his neighbors saw uneven patches of vegetation competing for space, he began to recognize layers of interaction between species, noting how certain grasses seemed to anchor the soil more firmly after rainfall, how clusters of wildflowers attracted insects that had been absent for years, and how the ground itself, once prone to forming a hard crust under the sun, now remained looser and more receptive to moisture, if it were relearning how to breathe after decades of being forced into a narrow rhythm. The absence of machinery noise, which had once defined the seasonal cadence of his farm, created a silence that was initially unsettling, but gradually transformed into something more revealing, because without the constant churn of engines and the rigid schedule of planting and harvesting, Thomas could hear subtler signals from the land, the shift in wind patterns across taller grasses, the increased presence of birds that nested in areas previously cleared for efficiency, and even the way water moved across the surface during a storm, no longer rushing away as quickly but instead lingering, soaking in, and leaving behind a different texture in the soil that suggested resilience rather than depletion. Despite these observations, the external pressures did not ease, and in fact began to intensify as planting season for most farmers reached its peak, because while others invested in seed at rates of approximately 60 to 90 pounds per acre and calculated fertilizer applications down to precise nitrogen units, Thomas made no such purchases, and the absence of these transactions did not go unnoticed by suppliers who had long depended on predictable orders, leading to conversations that carried an undercurrent of concern disguised as curiosity, with questions framed politely but rooted in the assumption that he would eventually return to the system that supported the entire local economy. At the same time, the financial strain continued its steady accumulation, because without the inflow of revenue from wheat sales, Thomas was forced to make difficult decisions about which expenses could be delayed and which could not, choosing to postpone certain equipment repairs while ensuring that property taxes were paid on time, a balancing act that felt increasingly precarious as interest on his operating loan compounded quietly in the background, turning time itself into a cost that could not be ignored. And as letters from the bank grew more direct in their language, referencing deadlines and potential consequences with a clarity that left little room for interpretation, the experiment he had initiated began to intersect more sharply with the reality of institutional expectations. Margaret watched this intersection with a perspective that combined empathy and pragmatism, understanding both the significance of what Thomas was attempting and the tangible risks it carried. And while she continued to support him in public, enforcing his decisions in conversations with neighbors who offered unsolicited advice, she also pressed him in private to articulate not just what he was observing, but what he planned to do with those observations, because recognizing patterns in the land was one thing, but translating them into a viable system that could sustain their livelihood was another entirely. And it was in these conversations that Thomas began to realize that observation alone would not be enough, that if he wanted to move forward, he would need to begin shaping the process rather than simply witnessing it. This realization marked a subtle but significant shift in his approach, because instead of allowing the land to evolve without any guidance, he started to experiment with small interventions that aligned with the natural patterns he had been documenting, selectively encouraging certain native species that appeared to improve soil structure, while limiting others that seemed to dominate without contributing balance, using tools as simple as timing and minimal disturbance rather than heavy machinery, and in doing so, began to construct the early framework of a system that did not rely on uniformity but instead embraced diversity as a form of strength, a concept that felt intuitive to him but remained largely incomprehensible to those who measured success in straight lines and consistent yields. As the season progressed and early summer approached with temperatures climbing back into the 80s and 90s, the visual difference between Thomas's land and that of his neighbors became impossible to ignore, because while surrounding fields displayed the familiar, orderly waves of wheat nearing harvest, his acreage presented a mosaic of textures and colors that shifted with the light, appearing at times vibrant and at other times chaotic, depending on the perspective of the observer. And it was within this contrast that the true tension of his decision began to crystallize, not just as a personal gamble, but as a visible challenge to the assumptions that had defined farming in that region for decades, raising a question that extended beyond his own property lines and into the collective mindset of the community. If this unconventional approach were to succeed, what else might they have been wrong about all along? By late summer of 1986, when the Kansas heat settled in like a heavy lid that pressed down on every acre and tested the limits of both crops and patience, Thomas Hale's experiment began to reveal not just patterns but mechanisms, because what had once looked like uncontrolled growth now showed signs of internal logic, with certain native grasses extending roots as deep as 6 to 8 feet into the soil, breaking through compacted layers that decades of shallow wheat planting had never disturbed, while other species spread laterally across the surface, creating a living cover that reduced evaporation and shielded the ground from the punishing sun. And as Thomas compared notes from different sections of his land, he began to map these interactions with increasing precision, treating his 640 acres not as a single field, but as a series of interconnected zones that responded differently to rainfall, temperature, and biological activity. He started measuring soil moisture after storms using simple probes, discovering that areas with denser native growth retained up to 30% more water than sections that had been left more exposed, and this difference, while not immediately convertible into profit, hinted at a kind of resilience that conventional wheat systems struggled to achieve during dry years, especially in a region where annual rainfall often hovered between 18 and 24 inches and could drop unpredictably, turning an average season into a financial gamble that few farmers could afford to lose. The machinery that once defined his productivity now became tools of selective use rather than constant operation, with the 1978 John Deere 444 no longer pulling drills across every acre, but instead used sparingly to manage specific patches where balance needed adjustment, and even then, Thomas avoided deep tilling, opting for minimal disturbance that preserved the emerging structure of the soil, a choice that baffled equipment dealers who saw underutilized machinery as wasted investment, and neighbors who interpreted the quiet fields as evidence of decline rather than transformation. At the same time, Thomas began to explore the possibility that his land might produce value in ways that did not rely on bulk commodity markets. Because while wheat prices continued to fluctuate between $3 and $3.50 per bushel with little regard for individual effort, noticed that some of the native plants returning to his fields had uses that extended beyond mere ground cover, including species with medicinal properties, others that could be harvested as specialty grains or seeds, and still others that supported pollinators essential to broader agricultural systems. And although these observations did not yet form a clear business model, they suggested that the definition of a crop might be more flexible than he had been taught. This line of thinking led him to correspond with a small network of agricultural researchers and unconventional farmers scattered across the country, individuals who were experimenting with organic methods, permaculture principles, and low-input systems that prioritized long-term soil health over immediate yield. And through letters that took days or weeks to arrive, Thomas began to piece together a broader context for his own work, realizing that while he was isolated geographically, he was not alone conceptually, and that others were asking similar questions about sustainability, resilience, and the true cost of maximizing short-term output. However, the gap between insight and income remained a pressing challenge, because as the harvest season of 1986 concluded for his neighbors, with combines rolling across golden fields and trucks lining up at grain elevators, Thomas had nothing to sell, no bushels to weigh, no checks to deposit, and this absence became impossible for the bank to ignore, culminating in a formal notice that outlined the risk of foreclosure if his financial position did not improve within a defined time frame. Document that transformed abstract pressure into immediate threat and forced Thomas to confront the possibility that his experiment might not be given enough time to prove itself. Standing at the edge of his land one evening as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the diverse vegetation that had replaced uniform wheat, Thomas held that notice in his hand and felt the full weight of the path he had chosen. Because while the land beneath him showed signs of recovery that he could not deny, the system surrounding him measured success in entirely different terms. And as the wind moved through grasses that were no longer considered weeds in his mind, but had not yet become recognized assets in anyone else's, he faced a question that cut deeper than any previous doubt, one that demanded not just belief but action. Could he transform this evolving ecosystem into something the market would finally understand before the bank decided he had already run out of time? As the calendar turned into early 1987, bringing with it a winter that was colder than the previous year and marked by sharp temperature swings that tested both soil and spirit, Thomas Hale began to confront the reality that observation and small-scale adjustments would no longer be enough, because the system he was nurturing needed to move from passive recovery into active design if it were to survive not just ecologically but economically, and so he shifted his focus toward identifying which elements of the returning native ecosystem could be structured into a repeatable process, one that could produce outputs measurable not just in improved soil health, but in actual goods that someone, somewhere, would be willing to pay for. He started by cataloging the species that had established themselves most successfully across his 640 acres, noting their growth cycles, resilience to frost, and interactions with surrounding plants, and among them he identified a handful that showed particular promise, including native prairie grasses that produced seeds with nutritional value, wild herbs that had historical uses in teas and remedies, and flowering plants that supported a growing population of pollinators, each of which represented not just a biological function, but a potential product, provided he could figure out how to harvest, process, and present them in a way that fit within an emerging but still fragile market for organic and natural goods. The challenge, however, was that no local infrastructure existed to support this kind of production. Because grain elevators were designed for bulk commodities like wheat and corn, not for small batches of diverse plant materials. And the supply chains that connected Kansas farms to buyers were built around volume and uniformity rather than variety and nuance, meaning that Thomas would have to construct not just a farming system but an entirely new pathway to market, one that bypassed traditional channels and required him to think less like a commodity producer and more like an independent operator navigating uncertain terrain. To begin this transition, he repurposed part of an old storage barn on his property, converting it into a makeshift processing area where he could clean, dry, and sort small quantities of seeds and plant materials, using modified equipment and improvised techniques that reflected both ingenuity and necessity, because without access to specialized machinery, he relied on gravity, airflow, and time to separate usable products from debris. Slow and labor-intensive process that demanded patience, but allowed him to maintain control over quality in a way that large-scale systems often sacrificed for efficiency. Margaret played an increasingly active role during this phase, helping to organize the growing inventory of materials, researching potential buyers through mail-order catalogs and agricultural bulletins, and even drafting letters to small health food stores and cooperatives in distant cities, where interest in organic products was beginning to surface, albeit quietly, as part of a broader cultural shift that had not yet reached mainstream agriculture, but was gaining traction among certain groups willing to pay a premium for goods perceived as more natural or sustainable. At the same time, Thomas continued to refine the ecological balance of his land, introducing controlled disturbances in specific areas to prevent any single species from dominating, while allowing others to expand in patterns that supported overall diversity. Practice that required careful timing and a deepening understanding of seasonal cycles, because unlike wheat, which followed a relatively predictable schedule, the native system responded dynamically to weather variations, with some plants thriving in wetter conditions and others asserting themselves during drier periods, creating a constantly shifting mosaic that demanded flexibility rather than rigid planning. Financially, the situation remained precarious, because while small sales began to trickle in from experimental batches sent to distant buyers, the revenue was inconsistent and insufficient to cover the full range of expenses, and the bank, operating on timelines that did not accommodate gradual transformation, continued to press for evidence of stable income, setting deadlines that loomed closer with each passing month, and forcing Thomas to accelerate a process that ideally would have unfolded more slowly, increasing the risk that missteps could undermine the fragile progress he had made. Yet within this pressure, a new kind of clarity began to emerge, because the necessity of survival forced Thomas to articulate his system in terms that others could understand, translating ecological principles into practical benefits, such as reduced input costs, improved drought resilience, and the potential for diversified income streams, and it was through this translation that he started to see a path forward, not as a return to the old model of wheat production, but as the creation of something fundamentally different, a farm that operated more like an ecosystem than a factory, and that, if he could hold it together long enough, might prove that the very thing that had once been dismissed as weeds could become the foundation of a new kind of agriculture. By the late summer of 1988, after nearly 3 full growing cycles without a single acre devoted to traditional wheat, the strain that had once felt like a distant pressure finally condensed into something sharp and unavoidable. Because the fragile balance Thomas Hale had been building between ecological recovery and financial survival began to tilt under forces that did not care about long-term vision. A combination of lower-than-expected rainfall and a miscalculation in one of his early harvest batches left him with fewer viable products to sell just as his largest outstanding loan reached its renewal deadline, creating a moment where timing, which had once been his quiet ally, turned into an adversary that compressed years of experimentation into a single point of judgment. The notice from the bank arrived not with dramatic language, but with a precision that made it more unsettling, outlining in clear terms that without demonstrable improvement in income or a credible plan for repayment, foreclosure proceedings would begin within 90 days, timeline that did not account for the rhythms of ecosystems or the gradual establishment of new markets, but instead reflected the rigid structure of a financial system designed for predictability. And as Thomas read the document at the kitchen table while Margaret stood silently nearby, the weight of every decision he had made since 1985 seemed to converge into a single question of consequence. Had he been building a future or merely delaying an inevitable collapse? Outside, the land itself showed no awareness of this deadline, continuing its quiet evolution with late-season blooms attracting insects in numbers that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, and soil that now held moisture even after extended dry spells. Yet these indicators of recovery could not be converted into immediate currency, and so Thomas faced the difficult task of bridging a gap between two systems that operated on entirely different timelines, one measured in seasons and soil health, the other in quarterly statements and due dates. In response, he made a series of decisions that carried both risk and necessity, increasing the scale of his harvesting efforts for select native species that had shown consistent demand in his limited sales, even though doing so required longer hours, more labor, and a level of coordination that his small operation was not fully equipped to handle, while at the same time reaching out more aggressively to potential buyers, expanding beyond the handful of contacts he had cultivated to include specialty food distributors, herbal product companies, and cooperative markets in cities where the idea of organic and naturally sourced goods was beginning to move from curiosity toward trend. Margaret intensified her role as well, organizing shipments, managing correspondence, and negotiating prices with a persistence that transformed their operation from a quiet experiment into something that resembled a small but determined business. And together they began to see slight shifts in response, with some buyers expressing interest not just in the products themselves, but in the story behind them, a narrative of land restoration and unconventional farming that carried a value beyond the physical goods, hinting at the possibility that their greatest asset might not be a single crop, but the entire system they had built. However, even as these opportunities began to surface, the gap remained significant, because scaling production without compromising the ecological balance required careful planning, and any misstep could undo years of progress, forcing Thomas to make difficult choices about how much to push the system in the short term versus how much to protect its long-term stability, a tension that mirrored the broader conflict between immediate survival and sustained success. The breaking point came during a late August meeting at the bank, where Thomas was asked to present his plan in terms that aligned with conventional expectations, including projected revenues, timelines, and risk assessments. And as he stood in a room that felt far removed from the fields he knew so intimately, he realized that the language he had been using to understand his farm would need to be translated into something that others could evaluate, not in terms of philosophy, but in numbers and outcomes. And for the first time, he laid out his approach as a system with measurable inputs and outputs, describing reduced costs due to minimal fertilizer and fuel use, diversified income streams from multiple plant products, and increasing demand from niche markets willing to pay premiums that could exceed traditional wheat prices on a per-unit basis, even if total volume remained lower. The response was cautious, but not entirely dismissive, because while the model did not fit neatly into established categories, it demonstrated a level of structure and intent that suggested it was more than a temporary deviation, and after extended discussion, the bank agreed to a conditional extension, granting Thomas additional time to prove that his approach could generate consistent income, a decision that did not eliminate the risk, but transformed it into a window of opportunity, narrow and uncertain, yet real enough to act upon. As Thomas left the meeting and stepped back into the open Kansas air, where the wind moved across fields that no longer resembled those of his neighbors, but had become something uniquely his own, understood that the next phase would determine not just the fate of his farm, but the validity of everything he had believed about the land, because the question was no longer whether the system could work in theory, But whether it could endure the pressure of reality long enough to be recognized as something more than an outlier, something that others might one day consider not as a risk, but as a possibility. The shift did not arrive as a sudden breakthrough or a dramatic turning point that could be easily marked on a calendar, but rather as a series of small, almost unremarkable confirmations that began to align in late 1989, forming a pattern that Thomas Hale recognized not because it was loud, but because it was consistent, like a quiet rhythm that had finally found its tempo after years of uncertainty. And it began with a letter from a small organic distributor based in Colorado, a company that had been experimenting with sourcing non-traditional plant products for a growing network of health food stores, expressing interest not just in purchasing a limited batch of Thomas's harvested seeds and dried herbs, but in establishing a recurring supply agreement provided that quality and volume could be maintained at a reliable level. At first, the offer seemed modest when compared to the scale of conventional wheat contracts, because instead of truckloads measured in thousands of bushels, the agreement focused on smaller, carefully processed quantities, priced significantly higher per unit, but requiring a level of consistency that Thomas had not yet fully demonstrated, and yet within that difference lay the first tangible evidence that his system could connect to a market willing to value what he was producing. Not as a substitute for traditional crops, but as something distinct with its own demand curve. The timing of this opportunity proved critical, because it arrived just as the conditional extension from the bank was approaching its midpoint, creating a narrow window in which Thomas could convert potential into proof. And so he committed to fulfilling the agreement with a level of discipline that matched, and in some ways exceeded, the rigor he had once applied to wheat production, carefully selecting harvest areas based on plant maturity, weather patterns, and soil conditions, and organizing the processing workflow within his barn to ensure that each batch met the expectations outlined in the contract, transforming what had once been experimental output into a structured operation with defined standards. Margaret expanded her role further, coordinating logistics, managing communication with the distributor, and tracking financial flows with a precision that allowed them to see, for the first time in years, a direct relationship between their work and measurable income. And as payments began to arrive, initially small but steady, the abstract idea of a diversified revenue stream started to take on concrete form, providing not just financial relief but validation that their approach could exist within the broader economy rather than outside of it. Meanwhile, the land itself continued to evolve in ways that reinforced the sustainability of the system, because by the third and fourth years of minimal disturbance and increased biodiversity, the soil structure had improved to the point where it could absorb heavy rainfall without significant runoff, reducing erosion and preserving nutrients that would have otherwise been lost, and during a particularly dry spell in the summer of 1989. When neighboring wheat fields showed signs of stress with thinning stalks and reduced yields, Thomas's acreage maintained a level of vitality that drew quiet attention, not in the form of open praise, but in longer glances from passing trucks and fewer jokes in town conversations. The combination of ecological resilience and emerging market demand created a feedback loop that began to stabilize the operation, because improved soil health supported more reliable plant growth, which in turn allowed for more consistent harvesting, which then strengthened relationships with buyers, gradually reducing the volatility that had defined the earlier years of the experiment. And while the total revenue still did not match the peak years of traditional wheat production, the reduction in input costs, including fuel, fertilizer, and seed purchases, narrowed the gap significantly, revealing a different kind of efficiency that had been invisible under the old model. By early 1990, Thomas was able to present updated financial records to the bank that showed not only incoming revenue, but a trajectory of growth, supported by contracts that extended beyond a single season and diversified across multiple products. And although the figures required careful explanation due to their unconventional structure, they demonstrated enough stability to shift the bank's perspective from skepticism to cautious acceptance, resulting in a restructuring of his loan terms that reduced immediate pressure and allowed for longer-term planning. Standing once again at the edge of his land, now several years removed from the moment he had chosen to stop planting wheat, Thomas could see not just the physical transformation of the fields, but the emergence of a system that connected soil, plants, markets, and time in a way that felt both fragile and enduring, because while the risks had not disappeared, they had changed in nature, becoming challenges of management and growth rather than questions of survival, and as the wind moved through grasses that had once been dismissed as worthless, carrying with it the subtle sound of a system in motion, he understood that the reversal he had been hoping for was not a single event, but a gradual alignment of factors that together had begun to turn uncertainty into possibility. By the mid-1990s, as the agricultural landscape across the Midwest continued to chase higher yields through increasingly intensive methods, Thomas Hale's farm had quietly become something else entirely, system that no longer needed to prove its survival but instead began to demonstrate its strength in ways that were difficult to ignore, because while neighboring fields still rose and fell with the volatility of wheat prices, which hovered unpredictably between $3.20 and $4.10 per bushel, depending on global supply shifts, Thomas's operation drew income from a diversified portfolio of products, including native grass seeds, dried herbs, and specialty plant materials, each with its own pricing structure and demand cycle, creating a financial rhythm that was less dramatic but far more stable over time. The original 640 acres had effectively transformed into a living network of zones, each managed with a level of intention that reflected years of accumulated knowledge. Where certain sections were left to regenerate fully, others were harvested on rotating schedules to maintain plant diversity, and a few were designated for experimental species that could expand his product range, and this structure allowed Thomas to respond to changing conditions not by forcing uniformity, but by adjusting emphasis, increasing harvest in one area while allowing another to recover. Flexibility that proved particularly valuable during years when rainfall patterns shifted unpredictably and traditional farms struggled to maintain consistency. What had once been a solitary experiment began to attract attention beyond casual observation, as researchers from regional universities reached out to study his land, documenting soil organic matter increases that had risen steadily over the previous decade, in some areas doubling compared to nearby conventionally tilled fields, and noting improvements in water infiltration rates that reduced runoff and preserved moisture even during extended dry periods, findings that translated into language the broader agricultural community could understand, not as abstract philosophy, but as measurable outcomes tied to resilience and long-term productivity. At the same time, the market that had once seemed distant and uncertain continued to expand, as organic and natural products moved from niche curiosity toward a more established segment of the food and wellness industry, allowing Thomas to negotiate better contracts, secure longer-term agreements, and even command premium prices for certain high-demand products, in some cases exceeding the per-acre profitability of wheat during average years, particularly when factoring in his significantly lower input costs, which remained a fraction of what conventional operations required for seed, fertilizer, and fuel. Margaret, whose role had evolved alongside the farm itself, formalized their operations into a small but efficient business structure, managing records, coordinating shipments, and maintaining relationships with buyers who now saw Thomas not as an outlier, but as a reliable supplier within a specialized market. And together they created a system where each season built upon the last, not through expansion of acreage or intensity, but through refinement of processes and deepening of understanding, turning what had once been uncertainty into a form of quiet confidence. The community that had once viewed Thomas with skepticism began to shift in subtle ways, as a few neighboring farmers, facing their own challenges with declining yields and rising costs, approached him with questions that were no longer framed as jokes, asking about soil health, water retention, and the possibility of integrating small changes into their own systems, And while Thomas did not present his approach as a universal solution, he shared his observations openly, emphasizing that what worked on his land was the result of years of adaptation rather than a formula that could be applied overnight, a perspective that reflected both humility and an understanding of the complexity he had come to respect. Standing in the same fields where, a decade earlier, he had questioned whether he was witnessing renewal or decline, Thomas could now see the full arc of what he had set in motion, not as a rejection of farming, but as a redefinition of it, where success was no longer measured solely in bushels per acre, but in the ability of the land to sustain itself, to adapt, and to provide value across multiple dimensions. And as the wind moved once again through grasses that had become both symbol and substance of his journey, carrying seeds that would continue the cycle long after any single season had passed, he understood that the true payoff of his decision was not just financial recovery, but the creation of a system that could endure beyond him, rooted not in control but in partnership with the land itself. In the closing years of the 1990s, as the century itself seemed to be leaning toward a new set of questions about sustainability, resource limits, and the long-term consequences of industrial systems, Thomas Hale's farm stood not as a monument or a model to be copied outright, but as a quiet argument that had unfolded over time, written not in theory but in seasons, mistakes, adjustments, and persistence. And it was in this period that the meaning of what he had done began to extend beyond the boundaries of his own 640 acres and into something more enduring, something that could be observed, interpreted, and carried forward by others, even if they never met him directly. The grasses that had once been dismissed as weeds had become a kind of living archive, each species representing a decision not to eliminate but to understand, and as they continued to cycle through growth and decay, seeding and reseeding across the land, they formed a system that no longer depended on constant intervention, requiring instead a form of stewardship that was less about control and more about attention. A shift that Thomas often struggled to explain in simple terms because it ran counter to the instincts he himself had been taught, yet had proven itself through years of evidence that could be seen, touched, and measured. Visitors began to arrive with increasing frequency, some drawn by academic curiosity, others by practical need, and a few by a sense that something important had happened there that they did not yet fully understand. And as Thomas walked them through fields that no longer resembled the orderly rows they expected, he spoke not in absolutes but in observations, describing how soil that once resisted water now absorbed it, how input costs that once dictated his decisions had been replaced by processes that worked with natural cycles, and how the financial stability he had achieved did not come from maximizing a single output, but from allowing multiple smaller outputs to coexist and support one another. System that looked less efficient on paper, but proved more resilient in reality. Margaret, whose presence had been constant through every phase of uncertainty and recovery, often reminded him that what they had built was not just a farm, but a way of thinking that required patience to be understood, and together they documented their methods, not as rigid instructions but as a record of principles that others could adapt to their own conditions, understanding that no two pieces of land would respond in exactly the same way, yet believing that the underlying approach, respect for diversity, minimal disturbance, and attention to long-term health, could translate across different environments. By the time Thomas reached the end of the decade, the question that had once kept him awake at night, whether he was restoring the future of his farm or quietly ending it, had resolved itself not through a single answer, but through a lived outcome where the land continued to produce, the business continued to operate, and the system he had nurtured showed no signs of collapse. And in that quiet continuity lay the true measure of success, not a dramatic victory, but the absence of failure over time, steadiness that had been earned through years of uncertainty, rather than guaranteed by any initial plan. On certain evenings, when the light stretched low across the fields and the wind moved in slow, deliberate waves through grasses that had once been uprooted without a second thought, Thomas would stand at the edge of his land and hold a handful of seeds, small, unremarkable, and easily overlooked, yet carrying within them the entire history of what had been rebuilt. And in those moments, the symbol that had followed him from the beginning revealed its full meaning, because what he had once been told to destroy had become the very thing that sustained him, not just economically, but as a reminder that value is often hidden inside what the world has not yet learned how to see. And if there was a philosophy that emerged from those years, it was not one that could be reduced to a slogan or a simple rule, but rather a quiet understanding that systems built on control alone eventually exhaust themselves, while those that learn to cooperate with complexity, even when it appears chaotic at first, can endure in ways that are both subtle and profound. A lesson written not in a single season, but across decades carried forward by wind, soil, and time.